Good evening. Thank you all for participating in the Women's Bee Group Speaker Series. My name is Sheena Canning. I'm one of three co-founders of the Women's Bee Group. The Women's Bee Group is a committee of the Chester County Beekeepers Association. The WBG has put together these talks in order to spotlight scientists, researchers, and experts who practice and or support sustainable, evidence-based, environmentally sound beekeeping and gardening methods. As some of you know, I'm also the horticultural committee lead, and we have a mostly native plant sale going on right now. You can ask me questions at another time about that. You can always email me. I have not always been so against non-native plants. I had a little area of native plants in my yard, and the rest was a mix of things that I like to look at, but it didn't provide much value to the ecosystem around me. I forget my precise origin story, but I know that Doug was a part of it. A gardener friend of mine had mentioned Doug a few times before I actually looked him up and heard a podcast that interviewed him. Never had I heard a more concise explanation of what makes native plants so important and why we should care about the insects that thrive on them. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 115 research papers, publications, and taught insect-related courses for 45 years. The environmental advocacy work he has done as co-founder of Homegrown National Park has made Doug one of my heroes. So, without further ado, here's Doug.
Well, thank you very much, Sheena. Okay, we're gonna ask the question: are alien plants bad? And I have alien and bad in quotes, because I've been taken to task for that title. When I use the word alien, this is what people think of. They say it's kind of a negative connotation, and I shouldn't do that. And they suggest I would call them exotic plants, but I think of exotic plants, I think of, striking or fascinating, strangely beautiful, enticing. I'm not sure that describes all non-native plants either. Other people have suggested out-of-towners, and they are indeed out-of-towners, or introduced. I like that the best. So we're going to change the title to Are Introduced Plants Bad? But what about the word bad? People say that's judgmental. And I'm going to fight back on that, because good and bad are relative terms, and they can be measured without subjectivity. But you have to ask the question, good or bad, compared to what? So if we ask the question, is Doug Tallamy good or bad at basketball? Well, if I compare my skills to my 3-year-old granddaughter, I'm pretty good. She can't even hold the ball. But every time I go up against anybody real, I tend to lose. So this is, who is that? LeBron. Yeah, I remember that game. So I'm gonna keep the word bad, because we can measure it. Are introduced plants bad? Well, let's think about what nature really is. It is it's really millions of very specialized interactions, largely between animals and plants. So this is one of those interactions, the relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns, and they'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to maybe a mile from the parent tree. Then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the objectives are going to go back in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between acorn weevils and acorns. I mean, specialization is throughout nature, particularly among native bees. We got 3,600 to 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. So this is Andrena facilii. It can only reproduce in the pollen of Phacelia. As a matter of fact, there are 63 species of bees native to California that can only reproduce on the pollen of native sunflowers. I guess all sunflowers are native, but specialized relationship between phlox and day-flying sphinx moths. This is Phlox divaricata in my yard. Well, they have very small corolla, and it's really designed for Day-flying sphinx moths like the snowberry clearwing, and you won't have the snowberry clearwing unless you have their host plant, which is coral honeysuckle. It's the only thing they develop on. So specialization in the natural world, particularly associated with food, is the rule rather the exception, and it always starts with plants. Today, though, specialized relationships are threatened by what we call novel ecosystems. That's a term coined by Richard Hobbs, where he says the ecosystems, most of them today, are really comprised not just of native members, but native and non-native organisms that have been thrown together in very recent evolutionary history, meaning they don't have an evolutionary history together. They've only been together for a very short period of time. And that means they have not had the time to develop the specialized relationships that dominate nature. So the question is, does that matter? When we lose specialized relationships, does that matter? And, people have been arguing about this for quite some time now. I don't know, 25, 30 years. These are headlines that have been in the New York Times. And there's a group that says, well, invasive species aren't always so bad and we overreact to them. I say we don't need to argue about it because, again, we can measure it. We can measure whether they're good or bad in particular circumstances, and that's really what I want to talk about tonight. But what we want to talk about is what the net positive or negative effect on an ecosystem is once we'll call them a novel species, a non-native species, enters that ecosystem. Some people just look at the positives or the negatives. We have to look at both and decide what the net change is. And then we can decide whether they're good or bad. These are claims that have been made about plant invasions. We're going to focus on plant invasions today. Saying, well, they're not bad. They say there's no global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. There are extinctions on islands, but they don't count, I guess. Post-invasion species richness is higher. Birds don't care if a berry is native or not. Invasive communities are different, but not inappropriate, whatever that means. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. And invasion is just another word for change. All of that has been written about. It's also been claimed that we don't like introduced plants because of nativism. We only like things that are native. Our response to introduced plants is based as much on aesthetics, morality, and politics as it is on science. And finally, introduced species can provide important benefits to ecosystems. So we're going to talk about all of that tonight. Oh, we don't want to forget this. Returning ecosystems to some mythical pristine state is a fool's errand. That has been claimed. And shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on being alien? So in other words, if you've been here long enough, maybe you're not non-native anymore. Mark Davis is a plant ecologist at Macalester College. He's actually written a book on invasive species. And he says, don't judge a plant by its origins, judge it by its function. And I agree completely with that. So we're going to judge our plants based on functions. Now, if introduced plants are the ecological equivalents of the native plants that they displace, there should be no impact on ecosystem function. That's what we want to measure. Do novel ecosystems, ones that have been invaded by non-native plants, function as well as co-evolved ecosystems? Well, in order to measure that, we have to be able to measure ecosystem function. And fortunately, there is a way to do that. Robert MacArthur, way back in 1955, wrote this paper that essentially claims, or hypothesized anyway, that when you have a diverse ecosystem, it is more stable and it's more productive. And if you plot that with the number of species on the x-axis here, as the number of species in an ecosystem goes up, so does ecosystem function. In other words, it produces more ecosystem services and it's more stable. Robert MacArthur called that the law of nature. Now he was actually a brilliant ecologist, theoretical ecologist, but he got a brain tumor very early on and died. I think he was in his 30s. So he never got to test this hypothesis. But a number of people have tested it since. These are just some of the studies, and it turns out Robert MacArthur was pretty much correct. As you increase the number of species in an ecosystem, the ability of that ecosystem to produce services and stability increases. But the opposite is also true. As you take species away from an ecosystem, then the ecosystem becomes more unstable and less productive. So that's good news because now we can measure ecosystem function simply by counting the number of species in the ecosystem. Does it go up or down or stay the same when it is invaded by non-native plants? So let's first ask, do non-native ecosystems contain as many species as co-evolved ecosystems? Well, we have introduced over 3,300 species of plants to North America from other continents. Now, many of them are running amok in our natural areas. This is kudzu, and those are the ones we call invasive species. Not all of them do that, but you might say, well, gee, now we have 3,300 more plant species in North America. Therefore, they should function better because there are more species in them, if the law of nature is correct. The problem is you have to measure ecosystem function where ecosystems function. They don't function on a continental scale. They function on a local scale. So we have to measure the number of species in an ecosystem locally, not nationally. And what happens when you have plant invasion is that that species richness does not go up, it goes drastically down. This is porcelain berry covering who knows what, and you see this all over the place now. This is Cape May, New Jersey, very important birding hotspot. That's a sweet gum, that's a black cherry, that's a viburnum. They're all dead. I crawled under there to find out, and they're covered with porcelain berries. So you've taken 3 or 4 species of woody plants and turned them into one species of non-native woody plant. The diversity of the system declines. This is a sagebrush community before the invasion of cheatgrass. This is a sagebrush community after the invasion of cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is an invasive species. It changes the fire regime. So rather than burning once every 40 years, as sagebrush often does, or typically does, it burns every 2 or 3 years and it kills all the sagebrush. So diversity is lost. This is Melaleuca in the Everglades, river of grass, no longer the river of grass where Melaleuca invades. This is Kogon grass in the southeast. The diverse ground flora has been totally replaced. This is Phragmites. That used to be a freshwater marsh. Now it's a single species. So you get the picture. Spotted knotweed. This is autumn olive. Right here in Chester County. So species diversity drops drastically after an invasion when you're measuring it locally. And here are just a few of the studies that have actually measured that. So we don't have to wonder whether it's true. These are published studies. So the loss of local species is not something we should embrace, in my opinion. And I don't think we should name our roads after invasive species. And I don't think we should spell it wrong when we do name our roads. But wait, is the number of species in an ecosystem the appropriate metric for measuring ecosystem function? Well, a long time ago, Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most underappreciated biologists, ecologists ever, said, no, it's really interaction diversity that is the key. I spelled that wrong, interaction diversity. Nature is a series of interconnected living species. It's not a collection of independent species. They are all interacting with each other. So we have to measure how the diversity of those interactions, that is what creates ecosystem function. Dan Jansen, more modern famous ecologist, way back in 1974, he was talking about the loss of species in Central America. And he said, what escapes the eye, however, is a much more insidious kind of extinction. It's the extinction of ecological interactions. So it took, 150 years for us to recognize that von Humboldt was correct, and we need to be looking at interactions, not the loss of individual species. So now the question is, do introduced plants reduce the number of species interactions in an ecosystem? So what's a good measure of interaction diversity? There are lots of measures, but I'm going to propose food webs because it's a critically important function of ecosystems, how energy is passed from plants through insects typically to vertebrates right up the food web. And the complexity of that food web is going to determine its stability and how well that energy is passed along. So let's look at insect-based food webs. They have the highest interaction diversity because, of course, there are the most insects out there. And I'm going to focus on caterpillars because they are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. That also comes from Dan Jansen. Um, just think of the thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars required to get one clutch of birds through to independence. Just one clutch of birds, and we want whole communities of birds, so we need a lot of caterpillars out there. So, what do introduced plants do to plant caterpillar interactions? Well, we've studied this a lot for a long time. The very first thing we did was to look at species or caterpillar interactions with plants in what we call the mid-Atlantic states. That's how we define the mid-Atlantic states. And we looked up host records in the literature of what caterpillars ate in the mid-Atlantic states. And we found that, of course, they are recorded much more often on woody plants. As a matter of fact, there's a 90% reduction between the caterpillars that are being hosted by woody native plants versus woody non-native plants. So some of the caterpillars do eat non-natives, but 90% of them don't. What happens to caterpillars when an introduced plant is closely related to a native plant? In other words, when it's a congener. And the idea here is that, let's say, Norway maple. It's an acer. It's in the genus Acer, which is it's the maple genus. Maybe insects that adapted to native acers, like Acer rubrum, red maple, maybe they already have all the adaptations necessary to deal with a non-native maple. It's a good hypothesis. And we tested that in a common garden experiment, 3-year experiment. And we found that caterpillar abundance was reduced 65%. This is our total here. This is generalist versus specialist. It was all pretty much the same. So the point here is that caterpillars were not able to use members of the same genus as well as they used the native member of that genus. There was a 65% reduction, even though they were congeners, and species richness, the number of species able to use these things was also reduced 58%. So that was a bigger reduction than we had expected. What happens when caterpillars are two caterpillars when an introduced plant is not closely related to native species? And then we had bigger reductions all across the board. Abundance was reduced 80%, and species richness was reduced 78%. So congeners actually did a little bit better than non-congeners, but there still was a big hit on the herbivore community when we brought in non-native plants. Well, that was a controlled experiment where we chose the species, we grew them right next to each other. Everything was highly controlled. That's not the way invasions are in nature. This is a hedgerow that has been invaded by autumn olive and multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and bush honeysuckle and all the stuff that we have around here. And what we did was go into hedgerows in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware and measure caterpillar abundance in hedgerows that were invaded versus hedgerows that were not invaded. And the real trick was finding hedgerows that were not invaded. And what we found was, so these are natural invasions, nobody's manipulating them. Species richness was reduced in the invaded hedgerows 68%. So the number of species reduced 68%. The abundance of the caterpillars in those hedgerows was reduced 91%. But what about the biomass, the actual weight of the caterpillars in those invaded hedgerows? Biomass is a measure of the energy flow through an ecosystem. That was reduced 96%. So if you think of these caterpillars as bird food, when you have an invasion, you reduce it by bird food by 96%, which might be one of the reasons we have lost 3 billion breeding birds in North America in the last 50 years. What about interaction diversity? We already said interactions are really important. They were reduced 84% in the invaded hedgerows. So big hit when invasive plants move into our natural systems. Why is that? So why are native plants so much better than non-native plants? And the answer is that plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their tissues with nasty tasting chemicals that our insects need to specialize to get around. They need special adaptations, specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But once they, and those, it takes a long period of evolutionary interaction with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like what I described. And I'll use the monarch butterfly as an example because we all know the monarch and we all know that it is a specialist on milkweed. And we probably know that milkweed is a toxic plant. You don't want to go out and eat milkweed. It's protected by cardiac glycosides, but it's also protected by sticky latex sap. That's what gives milkweeds its common name. When you break open a vein, all this white goo comes out. And if you get it on your hand, and let it sit there for a minute or two, it'll start to gel. It turns into a chewing gum-like substance, and that is its defensive property. It will glue the caterpillar's mouth shut, and then the caterpillar starves to death. But monarch butterflies, of course, eat milkweed. So how do they get around the cardiac glycosides and the sticky latex sap? Well, they get around the cardiac glycosides by having the enzymes that detoxify those compounds and store them in their body parts. But this is how they get around the sticky latex sap. You can watch this in your yard. Just plant a common milkweed and the caterpillar will walk onto the leaf. It usually goes to the end of the leaf and it starts to eat. And if any latex sap starts to come out at all, it will stop eating, turn around, go back up the leaf maybe 2/3 of the way, and then it starts to chew through the midrib. And it chews until it has completely severed the midrib. And what it's done here with this very simple behavior is block the canals that shunt the latex sap from this part of the leaf to this part of the leaf. So now this whole part of the leaf has no latex in it, and the caterpillar can turn around, go back down, and it can eat the leaf without any latex sap coming out at all. It's a very simple behavior, simply chew through the midrib, but it's one that most insects have not figured out how to do, and they are unable to eat milkweed because of that. Of course, when they do that, that actually flags the leaf, and it's a good way to hunt monarchs. You can just drive down the road and look at a milkweed patch, and if you see any flagged leaves, you know that monarchs have been there. So those are the upsides of specialization. Through the physiological means of getting around the cardiac glycosides and the behavioral adaptation to sticky latex sap, the monarch gets to eat a plant that most other insects are unable to do. The downside of specialization is that now that's all they can eat. So we've got 2,137 native plant genera in North America, and monarchs can only eat one, the Asclepias. But again, they're not different from most of the other insect herbivores. 90% of the insects that are out there are just like the monarch. They can only eat the plants on which they have specialized over the eons. And of course, when you bring in a plant from another continent, it hasn't been here nearly long enough for specialization to evolve. Well, if 90% of the insects are specialists, that leaves 10% that are not. Maybe they're making up for the loss of specialization. Maybe generalists can use introduced plants as well as native plants, and that will make up for the difference. It's a good question, and we studied that using a couple species. Luna moth is considered a generalist because it's recorded on, I think, 25 genera of native plants. What we did was rear Luna moths from eggs until they either made it to pupation or died on as many of the invasive plants that we could find in this area, from privet to paulownia, oriental bittersweet, right on down. And we compared it with their survivorship on sweet gum, which is their native plant in this area. So they survived a little bit on rough-fruited cinquefoil, not nearly enough to make it to pupation. This is the weight of the caterpillar when it pupated. So in other words, it died on all of these non-native plants. Even as a generalist, it was unable to eat any of the non-native plants. What about bagworm? They're even more generalized than Luna moths. I think they're recorded on 84 species of native plants. So we compared them to non-natives in this area. They did a little bit better, survived a little bit for a few days, but black cherry was their native host here. So again, they essentially died on everything except black cherry. And white-marked tussock moth was the most generalized insect that we looked at. It's recorded on something like 120 native plant genera. And again, it did a little bit better, but not well enough to actually reach pupation on anything except black cherry, a native plant. So generalists are not able to compensate for the loss of specialization. We're losing the generalists as well. And you might want to ask what a generalist is. And again, we went back to Luna moth. They are recorded again. I think I said 25 species of native plants, and we've got Luna moth eggs we collected from adults on the eastern shore of Maryland, where their native plant is sweet gum, and we reared them on as many species of native plants that they're recorded in the literature as eating as possible. They did survive they were very small, but they reached pupation on walnut, on black walnut. Um, Lived a little bit on these guys, but died on everything else. So the point here is, though, if you look in the literature, said, well, these guys are really generalists. They can eat all those plants. Maybe they can eat pin oak in the Ozarks. Maybe they can eat poplar in New England. But here, where they co-evolved with sweet gum, they're only able to do really well on sweet gum and do a little bit on walnut. So what this means is that generalists are often geographically specialized. So they're specialized on just a few plants in one particular part of the country, even though they're recorded on lots of plants when you look over the entire country. Point is, introduced plants destroy food web interactions. That's what all that research was about. And here are some of the publications that we've gotten from all of that research. Somebody once said that everything I do is anecdotal. I don't know why they said that. These are all published in scientific journals, peer-reviewed journals. But you don't have to believe anything I tell you. You can go out and test this yourself. I call this my 10 by 10 experiment. That's 10 feet by 10 feet. Maybe it's 12 feet. 12 feet by 12 feet, staked out in my yard. And you can determine how much life exists in this 12 by 12 space by determining the plants that are in there. You can keep it as lawn, and that's what it is here. And you can get on your hands and knees and count all the species that are surviving in that lawn. There's a few out there. Or you can put an oak tree in that 12 by 12 space. So here's a tree in my yard. It is covering that 12 by 12 space pretty nicely. And you can count all the life that is associated with that oak, which I did. Back in July 25th on 2014, I just counted the caterpillars on the lower branches of this oak tree. I did not get a ladder or anything else. And I found 410 caterpillars from 19 different species on that tree. And then I compared that to black cherry. Here's a black cherry covering about a 12 by 12 section again, and got 239 caterpillars from 14 different species. Then I went next door to my neighbor's house where he had 35 Bradford pears, calorie pears, and I counted all of the life that is on his lower part of his calorie pears. I did find one caterpillar from one species, and then I carved out a 12 by 12 section of his burning bush, and I found 4 caterpillars from one species, 4 tiny little leaf skeletonizers. So those are 2 introduced plants, and I did that all in the same day. You could do that same study as many times as you want, and you're always going to get the same results. I did do it the next day again using a different white oak and a different black cherry, different burning bush, different calorie pear. I get different numbers, but the same pattern. A whole bunch on the white oak, 53 caterpillars on the black cherry, only 2 on the burning bush, and 1 on the calorie pear. So the non-native plants are simply not supporting as much as the native plants. So if you don't want to believe the scientific literature, go out and measure it yourself. It's very convincing. This is the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill. I actually don't think it's there anymore, but it used to be the first establishment that you found after you crossed the Bay Bridge coming north. And Rick Dark and I did this. We were coming back from a talk in Williamsburg several years ago. And here are all the calorie pears, the Bradford pears in full bloom there, which, they're pretty, and that's why people plant them. What was interesting is we drove past the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill, and the very next property was this one, which was thoroughly invaded with the offspring from those ornamental plants. It turns out, was a land conservancy, which, now it's a Bradford Pear Conservancy. And the question is, does the Sunset Beach Inn and Grill have the ethical right to biologically pollute, I don't know how many acres this is, with their ornamental plant? The food web here is crashed. We hadn't done the caterpillar study yet, but I'm looking for a 96% reduction in caterpillar biomass in an invasion like that. Do they have the ethical right to do that? Why can't insects adapt quickly to non-native plants? That's another good question. People rightly point out that insects are capable of adapting very quickly to insecticides. You can get to insecticide resistance in just a few generations, but so they ought to be able to adapt to non-native plants just as quickly. Well, this is why that doesn't happen. When you go out and you spray a population of insects, there's typically a few that already have resistance to your insecticide. So you kill everybody else, but the few that have resistance remain. They're the ones that mate. And the next generation, there's a lot more that are resistant. And the generation after that, even more. And then finally, everybody is resistant. So the key here is that there was no adaptation actually necessary for the population to become resistant. There were individuals that already were, and the resistance simply spread, and it can spread very quickly in just a few generations. So that is not what happens when an insect is introduced to a new host plant. There's all kinds of adaptation that has to happen for the insect to be able to use that host plant. Let's consider all the behaviors that have to change for a host switch to occur. That's what it's called when you adopt a new host plant. It's a host switch. First thing you have to do is locate that plant. This is the red-spotted purple butterfly. It's flying around. It's going to locate this new plant in an array of a bunch of other plants using sensors on its antennae. So in order for her to accept a new plant, there has to be mutations in the sensors on her antennae. She then lands on this new plant and will taste it again with sensors on her tarsi, on her feet. That means there has to be simultaneous mutations in the sensor on her tarsi so that she will say, okay, this really is a viable host plant. Then she's going to lay her egg, but before she lays her eggs, there are sensors on her ovipositor, and she essentially tastes the plant again to make sure she's in the right place. So there have to be simultaneous mutations on the sensors on her ovipositor before she will lay the egg. All right, she's laid the egg. The egg is going to hatch. The caterpillar is going to eat the eggshell because it's high in protein. But then it has to start to eat this new host plant. So two things have to happen then. First, it has to accept the host plant as a host plant. It's got to taste it and say, okay, this really is a good plant, which means there have to be mutations in the receptors in its mouth parts. And then it has to have the physiology able to detoxify the chemical defenses of this new host plant. So there has to be all kinds of adaptation inside the caterpillar itself. So those are the things that have to happen. They've got to be able to find the host plant or the potential host plant in an array of other plants. They have to verify that it's a viable host by tasting the leaf waxes with sensors on its tarsi and its ovipositor. The caterpillar that hatches has to accept it as a plant and be willing to eat it, and it has to be able to detoxify the new plant's defenses. That is called a host switch. They do happen, but not very often. It is very difficult for all those things to happen at once. Let's look at the monarch butterfly again. It will actually mistakenly lay eggs on black swallowwort. Black swallowwort was introduced as an ornamental plant back in the 1800s, I believe. It is in the milkweed lineage, so it smells like milkweed. The monarchs will taste it or smell it with their antennae and come down. They land on it, and it actually tastes like, or again, smells like a milkweed with the sensors on its tarsi. They'll lay an egg on it, so the sensors on the ovipositor say, yes, this is okay. But when the eggs hatch, the larvae are not able to eat eat black swallowwort at all, and they all die. It has been here since 1854, so after 170 years of opportunity, the little guys still are unable to physiologically digest black swallowwort, and it has become an ecological trap. It just shows you how difficult it is for a host switch to actually happen. But I get this comment then. You claim it takes thousands of years, if ever, for an insect to adapt to a new host plant, but some other entomologists disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? Well, that does happen, and I explain it this way. There are two ways that insects adopt a new plant: host switching, that's what I just described, and host range expansion. So host switching is, again, it's very difficult to happen because there's so much adaptation that has to happen simultaneously. Host range expansion doesn't require any new adaptation. That's the difference here. Let's use the black swallowtail as an example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the carrot family. And we have introduced a number of plants in the carrot family, but black swallowtails are adapted to pretty much all the plants in the carrot family. So when we brought in Queen Anne's lace and carrots and dill and parsley, the black swallowtail already had all the adaptations necessary to eat those plants, so it could eat them right away. That's called host range expansion. It doesn't require any adaptation at all, and it has occurred at low levels throughout the insect community. Okay, here's one for beekeepers. This is the question I get fairly often, talking about privet, or I get the same question associated with bush honeysuckle. So privet flowers are good sources of honey and pollen for honeybees. If we remove privet from our natural areas, or again, substitute in bush honeysuckle, as part of our fight against invasive species, won't our honeybees suffer? Well, there's 7 species of privet that are invasive in North America, or maybe it's 9 species. And this is what they look like, particularly in the South. They get quite big. And when you have a privet invasion, that's all you have is privet. That's me standing there. And this is what they look like when they're in bloom. And yes, honeybees do go there. It's a good source of pollen and nectar when they are in bloom. But look, they only bloom for about a week in the year. And the other 51 weeks of the year, they look like this: no blooms at all. They're not providing anything for honeybees or our native bees. There are more than 1 million acres of privet in Alabama alone. And if you add up the privet all over the country, you're talking about many, many millions of acres covered with a plant that's only going to bloom 1 week of the year. So that is not a good source of nectar or honey or pollen for honeybees. Because what are they going to do the other 51 weeks of the year? What are the native bees going to do the other 51 weeks of the year? Because these plants push out a diversity of blooming plants. So I still support the removal of privet and these invasive plants, the bush honeysuckle and the other things that autumn olive, all the same thing. They're not blooming long enough to provide a reliable source of pollen and nectar. Do birds care whether a berry is native or not? Well, let's look at the relationship between birds and berries. Berries, of course, are produced by plants so that the bird will take the berry someplace else and disperse the seed. And in order for that to happen, the plant has coated the seed with a tasty morsel that we call a berry. And the birds do eat them, and they fly away and then poop out the seed, and that's how the seed moves around. So the bird will create a fruit that is attractive, or the plant will create a fruit that is attractive to the bird at the time of year they want their seed dispersed. So berries that ripe in the middle of the summer, like blueberries, are very high in sugar. And that's what birds want in the middle of the summer. They have just finished reproducing using mostly insects, which are high in fat and high in protein, but not high in sugar. So the birds are hungry for carbohydrates. They will eat these berries, fly away, and poop them out. Birds or plants that want their berries dispersed in the fall make berries that are high in fat. This is poison ivy, by the way. It's a great plant for birds. They love the little berries. They're not really berries, but they're very high in fat. It's good for the birds because birds that are overwintering need sources of fat to make it through the winter, and birds that are migrating need sources of fat to fuel that migration. And then finally, plants that want their seeds dispersed in wintertime, like Ilex verticillata here, winterberry, uh, make their berries inedible. They're very bitter through most of the winter, but when they thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze, they finally become edible. The sugar content jumps, and in early spring, that's when the birds actually come and eat these berries and poop them out. So in other words, the plants are attracting the birds at the time they want their berry dispersed. So if we look at the nutritional differences between native berries and non-native berries, and that's what Susan Smith Pagoda and others have done. Pagoda. It turns out that native berries, that particularly the ones that want their seeds dispersed in the fall, are all high in fat. Myrica pennsylvania, fanica, 50% fat. Viburnum dentatum, almost 50% fat. Spicebush, 48% fat. Even Virginia creeper, 24% fat. So these are high fat berries, exactly what our birds need in the fall. Non-native berries, again, produced in the fall, like multiflora rose, less than 1% fat. Bush honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, 0.7% fat. Buckthorn, 0.5% fat. Autumn olive, 2%. Oriental bittersweet, 2%. So in other words, these guys are very low in fat when our birds need high fat berries. They are high in sugar when our birds don't want high sugar berries, the fall. And it turns out that most or all, she's still doing work on this, but the pattern has held, are producing berries. The non-native plants are producing berries that are phenologically out of sync with the needs of our native birds. They're producing high sugar berries in the fall instead of the summer. So the birds eat them, of course, because in a plant invasion, that's all that's there. And if they're looking for a berry, they're going to eat it, even if it doesn't have the fat that they actually need. Okay, if an alien plant supports a particular butterfly, bee, or beetle, it is contributing to ecosystem function. There's a lot of papers out there that will measure some benefit that an alien plant or non-native plant produces and say, see, they're good. But again, this reasoning considers what's gained from the plant without considering what is lost through the presence of that plant. And that's what we have to do. Let's look at kudzu, for example. Now, kudzu now supports the silver-spotted skipper. That's a native skipper that has adopted kudzu, added it to its host list through host range expansion, because this guy is good at eating legumes. And there's a picture of the silver-spotted skipper caterpillar eating kudzu. So it really does happen. But what is lost when we have a kudzu invasion that covers all the plants and kills everything except the kudzu? You're losing your violets, which means you're losing all your fritillaries. You're losing your milkweed, so you're losing the monarch and all the other things that the large milkweed bug, the milkweed tussock moth, the milkweed beetles. There's several things that specialize on milkweed. They're all gone. If you lose your spice bush, and kudzu would easily overrun spice bush, there are 11 species that specialize on spice bush that would be lost. Greenbrier, you'd lose 19 species. Virginia creeper, you'd lose 32 species. Sweet gum, 35 species. Hackberry supports 43 species of caterpillars. They'd all be lost when the kudzu grows over the hackberry. Our viburnums support 104 species. Goldenrod supports 110 species. Black walnut, 129 species. Elm support 215 species, all lost when the kudzu grows over them. Maples support 297 species. And of course, oaks are number one, supporting 557 species in the mid-Atlantic states. They all would be lost in a kudzu invasion. And of course, you would lose the birds that require all those caterpillars. They wouldn't be able to reproduce either. There wouldn't be the thousands of caterpillars necessary. So you gain the silver-spotted skipper, but you lose thousands of other species. So when you consider the net change in interactions, you would easily decide that kudzu is not a great idea for our ecosystems. We need to look at the net change before we judge whether an introduced species is good or bad. Returning ecosystems to some mythical pristine state is a fool's errand. Well, that's not the goal. We're not trying to find some mythical pristine state. We're simply trying to recreate ecosystem function by returning the native plants that created. And they may be a little bit different from what was there 200 or 300 or 1,000 years ago, but you can recreate ecosystem function by reuniting those specialized interactions that I opened the talk with. Shouldn't there be a statute of limitations on being non-native? Um, Actually, I have data for that, and it looks like I left it out. You can compare how many species are using plants that have been here hundreds of years with the species that are using that plant in its native habitat. It's in the continent from which it came. And a good example is Phragmites. The common reed, it's a native to Europe. The genotype that is here is a native to Europe, where it supports 176 species of insects. It has been here for 400 years, and after 400 years, only 5 have adopted it. And again, that was host range expansion. They could use it right away because they already had the adaptations. So adaptation, host range or host switching does happen, but it's very, very slow. And even after 400 years, it is still acting like a non-native. Well, there you go. Introduced plants become a native when they act like a native. And there's the data that I was just trying to remember. I did include it. We don't like introduced plants because of nativism. Nativism, of course, is where you only like native species. I think that's ridiculous. If you look what is sold in nurseries, it's over 80% of the plants sold in nurseries are non-natives. We obviously love them because they're pretty, and we've been selling them in this country for more than 100 years. So nativism is not keeping our plants is not keeping the non-native plants out of the nurseries. And our response to introduced plants is based as much on aesthetics, morality, and politics as it is on science. The person who said that actually is an anthropologist, and he doesn't know anything about the science that demonstrates that introduced plants are not ecologically sound. So it really has, you can forget all about aesthetics, morality, and politics. Just look at the science and conclude that non-native plants are not such a good idea. So let's revisit. Plant invasions are not bad. No global extinctions recorded from mainland invasions. American bittersweet and red mulberry are soon going to be extinct, believe it or not, through introgression with non-native congeners. So the white mulberry and the oriental bittersweet are crossing with our native plants, and the end result is it's almost a pure non-native. So you have to go to Texas now to find real red mulberry, and you have to go to Maine to find real or native American bittersweet. And soon they're going to be gone altogether. So then there will be global extinctions. Post-invasion species richness is higher, not locally where it counts. It's much, much lower. Birds don't care if a berry is native or not. Yes, they actually do. And other research I didn't cover shows that when they have a choice, they always take the native first. Excuse me. Invaded communities are different, but not inappropriate. I still don't know what inappropriate means, so I can't comment on that. Introduced plants are here to stay, so we should embrace them. Cancer's here to stay too, but I'm not going to embrace it. So are introduced plants bad? Well, they're bad at supporting insects. They're bad at supporting insectivores. They're bad at supporting specialist pollinators. We didn't even get into that. They're bad at supporting complex food webs, stable food webs, local diversity, interaction diversity, and ecosystem function. So if we consider ecosystem function, we can say with confidence that introduced plants are bad. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Doug. I'm going to take a look at our chat. Okay, so we have a few questions here, and if anyone who's listening still has some questions, please try to type them into the chat or type in that you would like to ask a question. All right, we have Vidya who says, so far it seems that the non-natives are really not supporting much life. So in terms of good versus bad, non-natives versus invasive and invasives, Are there any non-natives that are providing benefit?
Well, yeah. So in that congeneric comparison, we found, on average a 68% reduction, but that was on average. Willows, it turns out, non-native willows are actually very similar to native willows. So apparently the plant chemistry is very, very close. It's salicylic acid in the leaves, and the insects don't seem to mind. Gallers mind, they recognize the difference, but most of the caterpillars, for example, will use weeping willow, even though it's non-native. Crab apples also very closely related to our native crab apples. Anytime a plant forms a hybrid where it crosses very easily, it shows they're so closely related that they don't mind, and if they don't mind, the insects don't usually mind. So the figures I gave you were average reductions, but there are some that are supporting our natives.
Okay. I was going to ask um, if you can, I know you have described in your books about how you have taken your property and have tried to eliminate or at least manage native or invasive species. Could you talk a little bit about that process? What you actually did to take those away? Did did you dig them up? Did you cut them and paint with an herbicide? Do you have any advice for us who are trying to manage our invasion here?
Yes, what I did was I got my wife to do it. That made it much easier. We did all those things. When we first got here, I actually helped her. We had some giant multiflora rose bushes. Back then, I had a tractor. I would crawl underneath, wrap a chain around it, and we simply pull it out. That was good. It made a big pile of bodies, but it also broke off a lot of roots, and they would come up from the roots. We did a lot of whacking out with a mattock. A mattock is it's like a pickaxe, but there's a broad end, and you can whack out a good sized rose bush or even a an autumn olive with it and get most of the roots. It's good exercise. Or you can saw it off at the base and paint it with an herbicide, not Roundup. That's designed for foliar spray. It's not a very good stump spray, but product called Garlon is good. It's oil based and it gets down and kills the roots. You use very little material that way. But if you don't want to use any herbicide at all, there's a technique that people are using successfully. So saw it off at the base and then get a square of black plastic. So something from maybe one of those big hefty garbage bags, cut out a square and put it over the stump completely and pin it to the ground with garden staples, and that's it. Leave it for at least a year. So what you're doing is making sure there's no sunlight that hits that stump at all, and it will eventually kill it. So I encourage you to go back and get the black plastic after a while, so we don't load the environment with plastic. But you can kill the root system without using herbicide, using that technique. Mowing does not control it. I mean, it'll look like it's controlling it, but it doesn't kill the root stocks. And as soon as you stop mowing, they'll come back like crazy. So any one of those techniques work. There are invasives that have beaten me, for example, like Japanese stilt grass. It's an annual, comes up everywhere. I don't know what to do with that. I mean, there,
Yeah,
there there are grass special herbicides, uh, but you have to be careful with that. So that one has got me stumped at this point.
yeah. What about lesser celandine? I'm battling that.
Yeah, Lesser selenite. Well, Lesser selenite, it blooms. It's already stopping blooming in a lot of places. And one thing about that is native plants will come up through those corms after it. You
Oh,
look at it, even where it dies back, things will come up. So it is spreading like crazy. But it's very tough to actually dig and remove. Or if you spray it, you're killing everything. So it's another one of those that I tend to ignore. Maybe I shouldn't, but because other things will grow through it later on in the season.
And can you talk a little bit about your initiative for the homegrown national park?
Yeah, we're a small nonprofit, and our goal, our mission is to convince the millions of people that are out there who do not know that they are the future of conservation. They do not know that there are four things their property needs to four ecological goals their property needs to accomplish if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with the planet. And of course, that we have to. And those are every property has to support pollinators. Every property has to support a viable food web. Every property has to manage the watershed in which it lies, and every property has to sequester carbon to help climate change. I always complain about lawn because it does none of those things. But any plant you can put in your property to help those ecological goals is a good thing. So it's a process. And Homegrown National Park is designed to get that message to all those people that don't know that. All the people that think that nature's happy in our parks and preserves, that don't realize that we need ecosystem function everywhere, not just in parks and preserves. And, let's face it, that's most of the people out there. So we use social media. We have what we call the biodiversity map, where you register your property on the biodiversity map and the amount of area you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the amount of lawn. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree and remove invasive species. And then your little piece of your county lights up with a firefly, and you get to see how many other people are lighting up with fireflies, how many people have joined Homegrown National Park. The interesting thing, I don't know if it's interesting, but the good thing about Homegrown National Park is that we don't charge, it's free. We're not trying to pull membership away from other organizations. We just want, there's an awful lot of very good conservation happening on private property, and we want to get that recorded on the map. And we want to encourage people that don't know that their property needs to be managed ecologically better. We want to get them on the map as well.
Oh, great. I will share some of those resources, the website for the club, because I think it's an important.
Yeah, it's just homegrownnationalpark.org, all one.
Yes. Yeah, because we all need a little bit of hope. There's a lot of doom. So let's see. Patty asks, well, she says that she agrees with moving to planting native plants, but she also asks, now keep in mind, Doug, we are beekeepers.
I know, I know you are. I
Should we
can't believe you
consider
asked me.
should we consider using European plants as well, since our bees are European? Does that help their health?
There's definitely room for compromise, particularly when you're looking at pollinators, as long as the plants are not invasive. We can't tolerate any more invasive plants, but there are plenty of plants that provide a lot of nectar and pollen, and they fill in the blanks when our native plants aren't blooming all that much. So things like zinnias that bloom for a long period of time, they're great. So keep in mind, though, you don't want to forget those specialist pollinators. That if you only plant for generalists like the honeybee, you're going to lose about 30% of our native bees. The very best plant for specialist pollinators are goldenrods and perennial sunflowers and native asters. They're all good for honeybees as well, but they support. If you have those three genera of plants in your property, you'll support at least 40 species of native bees. But no, there's nothing wrong with using European plants as long as they are not invasive, and have a good balance with those native plants.
Great. There's for those who don't know who are on this call, there are resources that Pennsylvania has for what is highly invasive, but there are also a lot of things not on that list that we do see as spreading quickly. So keep that in mind. Let me see. We have other questions. Is there a best time of day to count caterpillars, and how do you find them? Do you knock them off the tree? This is Priscilla who's asking.
Yeah, actually, the best time of day is at night. They're hiding from birds during the day, so they come out at night. So go out with a flashlight and look up in the branches. That's when you're going to find the most caterpillars. It depends if it's a bad tasting caterpillar like the monarch, they don't try to hide. They're right out there in the open. Then you can look for them during the day. But caterpillars are doing their very best to hide from you because if you can find them, so can a bird. So often they will, during the day, they'll move off the leaf and they'll be on the stem, or they'll be on the trunk of the tree, or they'll crawl up the tree altogether. So a lot of people, think they don't have any caterpillars when in fact they do. Um, but night is usually what throws people off. You're also looking underneath the leaf. A caterpillar on the top of the leaf is very obvious and will be picked off very, very quickly. So look underneath the leaves when you're looking.
Yes. Let's see. Lance would like to know if there is a recommended list of control measures for various invasive species that you know of.
Oh boy, there's a whole bunch of things out there. This is where Google is great. If you have a particular plant you're wondering how to control it, just Google it and you'll get all kinds of alternatives.
Okay. I wanted to ask about something too. Let me pull up my little list. Oh, I just started your mosquito bucket of doom. Uh,
That's not mine. I just
well, you had
support
shared.
that product because it works, but
So, I had a question about the. Well, I can post the video that I sourced from that you had explained that on your homegrown national park. But I had a question about you had mentioned putting hay in to allow it to ferment. And when you say hay, do you mean actual hay? Because I don't have hay. Like, can I put grass in the bucket?
yeah, what we're really saying is some form of organic material. Um, Dead grass would be much better than green grass. You don't want to make it you don't want it fermenting so much that it's toxic to the mosquito larvae. And just a handful. So most of it's going to be water, but you're adding some organic matter that algae and diatoms can use to grow because that is what mosquito larvae eat. So yes, it doesn't have to be straw or hay. Um, Dead leaves would be just fine.
Okay. So a little organic material, you keep it in for a day or two, then do you
Put
take
it
it?
out in the sun and let that's it. Put it out in the sun and then the mosquitoes will find it and lay their eggs in it. And you don't want to put your dunk in until you actually have mosquitoes going, which usually takes, you know, I don't know, more than a week anyway.
Okay. So then you put the dunk in, it kills them, and we're all happier.
Right.
And we do that. How often do
That should last about a month.
we?
Then maybe
Okay.
change the water and start again.
And why do we need to wait until we have mosquito larvae? Is it just so that your
But
bacteria has something to eat?
yeah, you're wasting your product. Otherwise, if you put it in there, there's no mosquitoes to kill. That doesn't last forever. So you'll get a longer acting bucket if you wait till you actually have mosquitoes in it.
Okay. And why is it important not to use mosquito Joe?
Well, I'm glad you asked because Mosquito Joe kills all the insects. It kills the monarch, it kills all your pollinators, it kills your honeybees, um, and it doesn't control mosquitoes. That's the problem. Mosquito Joe is going after mosquitoes in the adult stage, and you've got to kill 90% of them to get good control. Mosquito Joe kills about 40%. So that's why he has to keep coming back and back and back. And you have mosquito joe or your neighbor has mosquito joe and your pollinator population will go way down. Your natural enemies, all the tiny little hymenopteran that are controlling real pests, go down. um, I've got pictures of handfuls of dead monarchs after mosquito spraying. So it doesn't work, it's expensive, and it kills everything else. Those are three good reasons not to use mosquito joe. What is troubling to me is that they are allowed to have this false advertising. They say this is a natural organic product that only controls mosquitoes. And if that were true, I would hire them, but it's not true.
Mm. Mm. Is there, I wish there was something we could do about that.
We're actually doing a study this summer measuring the impact on non-natives. So we don't just say it kills them. We'll have numbers.
Oh,
uh,
fantastic.
and that will help, I think.
Okay. I think I got the one more question I had missed. Vidya had asked, are some of the non-native species that are specialized to non-native plants also making it over and doing well? For example, what species live on kudzu in its original home, and do they do any good?
A true bug called the kudzu bug has made its way over here. We didn't introduce it, but it's a specialist on kudzu. Is it controlling kudzu? No. Kudzu, it turns out, is really closely related to soybeans. So it's very difficult to bring something over to eat kudzu that doesn't also eat soybeans. And of course, that's not going to happen. So, yeah, there are lots of things that eat kudzu in China, but they also eat soybeans. So we're not going to import any of those.
Okay. I'm posting the mosquito bucket of doom link for the people who are asking. Um, I think that covers, let me see. I hope I got everybody's questions. Please, if anyone had a question unanswered, and if you are hearing me now, you can unmute and ask it. And if not, we really appreciate you coming, Doug. This is very exciting to have these questions answered. You do have a new book out. Do you want to talk about that real quick? Or
Like,
highlight any of your other books that might be helpful to our club members?
actually, there's the new book right there. Where I can grab it. It's called How Can I Help? That looks backwards to me. So,
No, it's correct on my
okay.
view.
Um, it's came out last Tuesday, and it answers 499 questions that people have asked me by email over the years. These are people that have already heard my talks and they've already read the other books, and they still have really good questions. So I decided to make a book out of it. And I don't know how it's going to do, but chances are, if you have a question, it's in that book, and that is brand new.
So I don't know if you can read the chat, Doug, but you've got a lot of folks thanking you.
Oh,
So
good. Well, thanks. I saw a chat earlier that said, what were the three plants I named? It was goldenrod and perennial sunflowers and asters are very good for specialist pollinators. And of course, if you look at them, they're also very good for honeybees.
can I ask a follow-up to that real quick?
Sure.
Is the Mexican sunflower, is that considered one of those
That's
a good
not
one for him?
Helianthus. I think it is a good pollinator plant, but I think it's a different genus.
Okay.
Um, so it's planting a non-native plant that's not invasive, and it should be fine.
Cool. All right. Well, again, thank you for the great presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Feel
It's
better
going
too.
to be a short day, but all right. Appreciate it. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye bye.